Yeah. Okay. All right. So again, the one thing I do have to preface on this is that remembering that sociology and psychology are very young as sciences, and social science as a whole is a very young field. I'm talking about what we know. This may not be the end of the story about why there is this thing we call discrimination and prejudice and all this other kind of stuff and group formation. But this is based upon what we know from what our research methods and observations are at this point. So I always want to preface that because there's always more complicated things that we still don't know. Okay. So I want to start by just kind of talking about the circle and kind of where we're going to head with it. Like I said, we're going to start with some broad theories that kind of overarch all of these processes, but these are kind of the things that we want to really think about when we really get down to the nuts and bolts. Okay, is when we think of the difference between stereotype and then prejudice and in-group favoritism and discrimination, we can kind of categorize them based on the system that is driving each of these. Okay. So when we talk about stereotyping, we're talking about a cognitive process. Here in a couple weeks, we'll talk about development of categories. Okay. And believe it or not, human beings seem to be born to be put things into categories to simplify the world. And in general, they work just fine. The most we've survived so far, I think, 50,000, 100,000 years or something like that, through this categorization process. But what we will see is that very early in infancy, almost it's observed scientifically by about 3 months of age, infants will start preference for mother's facial features, for the mother's or these days primary caregiver, the primary caregiver's skin of color, and even their accent. At around 3 months of age, we notice that infants take on the crying accent of their parent. So, for example, a German baby will cry at a German accent, a Spanish baby will cry with a Spanish accent, and so on. And it's really based on the mother's accent. Okay. And they start to discriminate between those features and features of people entering their world. So, for example, children tend to get very anxious, if you want to say it. In infants, we watch this behaviorally. They start doing avoidant behaviors between people who are very different from mom's accent, mom's color of skin, and mother's facial features. Okay. And they will be drawn towards individuals that are similar. Hence, it's very easy for infants to bond with aunts and the mother's brother, so that uncle on the mother's side. Children tend to bond with those more secondary relatives in some cases, than with others that are on like the father's side. Okay. So unless, of course, and there's research showing this, if father is the primary caregiver at that early of an age, or there's a caregiver like I can't remember a nanny at that early of an age, we're showing research that shows that they'll start to make those preferences. Okay. So this idea of categorization is occurring at a very, very early age. where we discriminate between those who are like us or like who we are around and provide us safety and security, and those who potentially won't. Okay. Other interesting research is early in infancy. If we show babies, for example, what most people would consider bad people versus good people. So in just as a very basic example, they take and they using computers, they make it so that they create emotionless faces of, say, let's say Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa, or they do this, and they do the same with emotionless faces of Adolf Hitler and what was the one that they used in the original research? Oh, Charles Manson. Okay. And what they do is they randomly, plus with some other pictures, like pictures of mountains and stuff like that, flowers, whatever, they will randomly show these pictures to infants. And what they found is that infants somehow have this capacity to do approach behaviors of pictures of people who tend to be safe. So they'll do approach behaviors towards the Martin Luther Kings and Mother Teresas of the world, and withdraw behaviors from people who have been historically not so good. So they'll do withdraw, they'll go into a fetal position, they'll cry, they'll try and not stare at pictures of, for example, Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler. Again, the manipulation is they take emotion out of the face. So they're just emotionless faces. And infants as early as 4 months can start to make this distinction of doing withdrawal behaviors versus approach behaviors. Okay. And then I think us as adults, dependent upon our lifestyle and whatnot, weed that out for some children, unfortunately, or life experience does that. Um, so my point being is that from a very, very early age, we start to categorize our world between those things that we think are safe and those things that we think are dangerous. Okay. Now, when we look at this from a group perspective, those individuals who are most like me, we tend to think of as safe. And I want to make this kind of clear. Groups that we vaguely understand or know um, tend to get to the most negative end because we fill in the gap with very little information. Okay. And so those are the groups that we tend to be most head towards a stereotype to more prejudiced thoughts about. Okay. Especially if within our group they are seen as a competition or a threat or something like that. Okay. Now, so that's stereotyping. It's taking whatever information you have about a group and creating the prototype for who they are if you have to interact with them. Okay. Prejudice, on the other hand, is more of an emotional response. Prejudice is this evaluation of whether or not I like that person or I dislike that person. I think well, you emphasizing the word well of that person, or I don't, and, or somewhere in between. Okay. Prejudice is really this negative evaluation of someone who is different than me. Okay. Now, it should be noted that we can have positive prejudice and negative prejudice. Okay. Meaning that we can see other groups based on limited experience as having very positive qualities. Okay. Negative prejudice is when we have very limited information about another group, but we have a negative quality about them. Okay. And let me give you an example that um, um, is commonly used. Okay. There was an anthropologist in the 1930s, and he was a white European, and he wanted to go study a Native American group. Okay. And so he moved his family from New York, and I think this tribe was in the Midwest, if I remember right. And he moved there, but he put his family in a community 40, 50 miles away, kind of like Tucson-ish in a way. And he put his white family and white kids in that white community. And then he went to the quote unquote reservation to do his anthropological work. Okay. The type of anthropological work he was doing is a technique where you go in as a complete, quote unquote, try objective observer, but you have to become part of the community, meaning you have to learn their behaviors, learn the way, learn how they uh, do things, how they see things, and you gain trust with the community in order to then start your observations. Okay, I can't remember the name of the research technique, but that's what he was doing. Okay. And his children constantly begged to go with him to go see, what dad is doing, the people he's interacting with. And so the story goes is he took his kids there, and everyone observed that anytime any of the native children tried to approach, quote unquote, his white children, he would make sure there was distance. He would go and separate them. Okay. And from an observational perspective, you would assume, he's prejudiced, so he's going to end up writing negative things about us. Look, he won't even let his children play with our children. And so everyone assumed this guy was being prejudiced. Okay. And in the next case, discriminatory, which is a behavior. Okay. But, and this is where I challenge whether you think this was actually prejudice behavior or discrimination or not. Before going to the tribal land, he had 3 children die of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was rapid in the Native American community that he was in. And so he knew tuberculosis is, I can't think of the word, is contagious. You get it through interacting with other people who have tuberculosis. Okay. And so he said, when the community approached him, he says, "Don't get me wrong. I love your children. I love these people, but I've had 3 children die of tuberculosis, and I don't want to lose my other children by putting them in a high risk situation." So, question is, was his behavior prejudice or not prejudice? If it was about the safety of his children because of a disease. It kind of gets complicated when it comes to those kinds of things. Another example is in Niagara Falls during a holiday. Uh, in a newspaper, there was like 20 or 30 inns and hotels that were advertising in the when they used to have paper newspapers. Okay. And to get into these hotels, you had to write them a letter and put it in a mailbox. Okay. So telling you the times that it was in. And so this researcher um, uh, did the exact same letter. exact same letter. The only thing he did was change the last name. One last name was Jewish. The second last name in the second letter was Gentile, meaning non-Jewish. Okay. And then he melded these letters to these inns and hotels. Okay. For the Gentile people, they got a 95% response from the hotels and inns that they wrote to. And of that 95%, 90% of those were offered a room. Okay. But just by the last name, never met these people, never interacted with them, just by reading a last name of the exact same letter, only 40% of the people with a Jewish last name got a response, and only 30% were offered a room. Okay. So think about that. How little of just knowing that a person is Jewish, building the stereotype they have in the head, and then having that effective response just by reading a last name. Now, is that a clear example of prejudice? I would probably say yeah. The first case is kind of on shaky ground because he was just trying to protect his children from a high-risk situation, known situation. The second situation, it seems a little bit more clear, right? And so this is kind of the flow of how the stereotype based on very limited information then can turn into prejudice. And then the third will, which is discrimination, which is the actual behavior. Okay. And we will, when we get to discrimination, we will see that there's about 5 types of discrimination, from passive to systematic to direct. Okay. And we'll get to those when we get there. All of them are pretty harmful in the end. Okay. So this is kind of where we're headed. Um, but one of the things I want to begin with is what is necessary just to create discrimination. Okay. And it's called what's known as the minimal group paradigm, meaning it only takes a minimal amount of information to create what we would consider as discriminatory behavior. So in this case, in the first research, random assignments into two meaningless groups, group A, group B, that's it, is sufficient enough for one group to have the need to be superior or take advantage of another. Okay. A good kind of almost real life example of this research is research that was done in the classroom, where teachers in the research category had children. They did it in elementary school, junior high, and high school, and it's replicated almost every time. Okay. Is that the teacher would go into the classroom and she or he would say something to the effect that, I have to tell you guys something. This is a special class. Um, and you're all here because you have some quality, but I have to tell you, the children in this classroom that are superior and are smarter, more intelligent, better grades are children with blue eyes. And children with brown eyes tend to be the ones that are kind of slow or less intelligent, get bad grades. Okay. And just by that manipulation, what happens in most of these research settings, the blue-eyed kids start to bully the brown-eyed kids. The blue-eyed kids actually do start to perform better, and the brown-eyed kids start to perform worse. Now, the most interesting part of this is the teacher would let this go for, well, almost in some cases till they were almost to the physical bullying point. And they come in the room and said, "Oh, I made a mistake. I made a mistake." It's actually the brown-eyed kids that are more intelligent than the blue-eyed kids. It was my mistake. I'm sorry, I read it wrong. Now, you would think the brown-eyed kids, because they were a group that was discriminated against, they received all the bullying and making fun of from the blue-eyed kids before, that maybe they'd be more empathetic, right? Wrong. They almost just switched groups where the blue-eyed, brown-eyed kids started to be mean and discriminate against the blue-eyed kids, and the blue-eyed kids became very submissive to the brown-eyed kids. And academically, the brown-eyed kids started to do better, and the blue-eyed kids started to do worse. Okay. And this is kind of what the minimal group paradigm is trying to get to, that we just need vague categories to set up the potentiality of discrimination and prejudice. Okay. And this culminated in what is known as the Robber Caves studies. Okay. It was done by Sharif and Gartner and DeVito. It was done in Robber Caves Park, Oklahoma. It's called Robbers Caves because it's where Jesse James and his partner Bella Starr used to go hide from law enforcement. So it's a national park for dedicated to those two. Um, and what they decided to do is they took 22 psychologically well-adjusted 12-year-old boys. Okay. Now, let me explain why they chose these children. All right. They chose children that didn't have histories of trauma. They came from stable homes, but they also made sure that they were equal on other things. So they had the same kind of grades. They were in the same, they were they made it so that they were all white Caucasian boys. They were equal on every status. Their economic statuses between their parents was exactly the same. So what we have is a very homogeneous group, which you would think because they're almost like each other that they wouldn't not like each other. And that was the assumption is what do you do when you take individuals who are exactly on the same level social economically, psychologically, education wise, and age wise, and you set up a situation where you have now this minimal paradigm idea. Okay. And so this is what they're starting with. And what they're going to do is they're going to randomly divide by using a coin, and they're going to randomly assign 12 children to what they call the Eagles group and 12 children to the Rattlers group. Okay. And they're going to see what happens when they start interacting. Okay. So what they do in the first few days, and you can kind of see it here in this line here, the Rattlers are going to be on this side of the park. Eagles are going to create this territory as theirs. And what they did is they actually brought the Eagle group in the first day because they didn't want to bring all the children in at the same time. Okay. And so they brought the Eagles in one day and the Rattlers in the next day. And they kept them for about a week or so completely separated for each other. Okay. And during that time, they did some very cohesive activities, created a sense of group and togetherness. They had them do activities that require cooperation, those kinds of things. And then near the end of the first week, they kind of got the groups closer so they could hear each other. Okay. And so you could hear you started to kind of get curious. Who are those people on that other side of the line, as you would say? And then, so this is an example of the cooperation tasks. So you see them putting this, carrying a canoe together, cooking together, all of these things, helping each other over a cement thingy, and those kinds of things. And that's the activities they did for about the first week. And then in the second week, they created competition between the two groups. Okay. And so, for example, in the second week, they ended up doing tug of war, things like baseball, football, highly competitive type of activities. Okay. And they wanted to know what would happen if they created this competition. And what they found is it created hostility. Okay. That by the end of the second week, one group would go tear down the other group's flag and tear it up. They would take cans of spray paint and go spray the other camp with spray paint. They would do kind of nasty tricks with the bathrooms. All of those kind, and they started to really kind of resent the other side. Again, 24 boys, same status, same ethnicity, same grades, same everything. The only thing, same activities. They engage in the same activities. The only real difference is a line in the park, and one side was called the Eagles, and the other side was called the Rattlers. Okay. Now, at the time, because you don't want to send your boys home with this aggressive thing. At the time, the main theory of reducing prejudice was integration, meaning just by simply putting groups together, you can reduce discrimination. So the first thing they did was I couldn't remember, eat together. Okay. So they would have the kids come and eat together just by having that pure interaction. They thought, aha, we'll see that they're like me, I'm like them, and everything would stop. And what that ended up in is food fights and in some cases fist fights. So that didn't work. They found that by having maybe some boys go sleep from the Eagles, go sleep in the dorms with the Rattlers, and then some of the Rattlers go sleep in the Eagles, that would do it. That didn't work. That ended up badly too. And they just could, so the researchers were kind of stuck. What do we do? We don't know what to do to um, get these boys to stop basically hating each other or discriminating against each other. Okay. And so what they ended up doing is kind of, and at the time it was very novel, is they had them do what's called a superordinate goal. A superordinate goal is when it has to do with both groups working together. So what they did is they assigned tasks that wasn't for the good of the Eagles or the Rattlers, but good for Robber Caves National Park. And they had to work together to achieve this superordinate goal. Okay, so I think, let's see, this is those attempts. So, for example, they had him fix this truck, put up this water tower together, clean these neutral buildings, clean up the park, and all of these things that required both instead of it wasn't about being a rattler, it wasn't about being a eagle, it was about it's needed for the entire park. Okay. And what they found is, and this is a grass, this is before and after, so you can see we have a reduction in we have a reduction in discriminatory behaviors, but an increase in favorable behaviors. So they left almost okay with each other. Not totally, but almost, at least, okay with each other. And so, what are some points that should be made from this type of research? One, it only takes the most vague category in order to create discriminatory behavior. You only need to have a vague idea of the other group and a vague idea of who you should be. Okay. Two, competition. And we talked about this at the beginning of the course about conflict theory and those kinds of things. Once competition is in the mix, that vagueness now becomes who is more superior than the other group, who is the ones in charge. Three, the only way we have been able to get intergroups to really work together is if there's a superordinate goal. Okay. Um, and maybe in the real world, one of the examples of this, kind of sadly, is 9/11. Okay. When 9/11 happened, the United States had a superordinate goal. We need to get back at whoever did this. And the majority of Americans, no matter where you came from, your religion, your ethnicity, whatever, kind of felt like, hey, we're a country and this shouldn't be happening here. Okay. And when we look at national polls that measure things like racial prejudice and discrimination, just after 9/11, following the following 3 to 4 years, we had the lowest rates of hate crime, of prejudice, and discrimination that this nation has seen since it was measured. Okay. And it's kind of an example of what we call a superordinate goal that kind of captivated everyone who was a citizen, as you would say, of the United States. Not everyone, but for the majority part. And that's a period where we saw the lowest rates of discriminatory behavior, hate crimes, and all of those types of things, which is kind of an interesting thing. Okay. Now, with that being stated, I think we also have seen what's called a rebound effect, that there's a certain level of discrimination and prejudice that exists within a society. And when that is suppressed, after the moments of suppression, it will have what's called a rebound effect, meaning it will come back multiplied. Okay. And as we have recorded since about 2008, clear up to today, we're seeing prejudice and discrimination and even hate crimes at almost the same levels we saw in the 50s and 60s. Okay. That then led to the civil rights movement. So, again, that rebound effect kind of kicked us in the butt, but we can see that if there is something that can unify individuals, that the differences become less important. And that's kind of what the Robert Caves experiment kind of showed, and our experience with gross measures from 9/11. So, kind of an interesting thought to think about. And these just kind of show the liking scale. So you can see the third week they didn't like each other, but then by the fourth, fifth week, fourth, fifth period of measurement, and we see all the positive measurements go up and the negative measurements go out down. So just some of the graphs that they produced from that experiment. Okay, so that's an example of what's known as the minimal group paradigm. And that's where most research on prejudice and discrimination kind of starts from. Okay. And what was I going to say next? Remind me. I was about to say something else. Okay, well, let's go on. So that's where it started. And then based upon that, we started to look at things like social structures and group status to determine which groups within a given society are most likely to be targets of discrimination and prejudice versus those who are not. Okay. And I will tell you that history kind of states this the best. whereas there's the most to profit off of another person, they can be a target. Where another person is seen as a threat, they can be a target. So we can see, for example, the historically in New York City in the early 20th century, it was the Irish versus the, dang, my brain is going, Irish versus, oh, come on. Has anyone seen the gangs of New York lately? Can't remember. But also in New York, it was the Catholics versus the Protestants. Um, Historically, we based prejudice on skin color, religion, everything else. There is a story of three priests that were Catholic priests that were driving through the southern kind of Bible belt of the United States, and they saw this black child walking down the street and whatnot. So they decide, hey, let's give him a ride. And they pick him up, and the one priest says, "So are you Catholic?" And the kid just replied, "No, I already have a reason to be hated. I don't need two." And so, pointing out, and the point of that story is that not only are we prejudiced and discriminatory based on people's race, it can be their religion. If we look at social economic status, and the more of those you have, the more likely it will be that you will experience and be the recipient of discrimination and prejudice. The less of those things you have, the more likely you'll be of what is known as the privileged within a society. So it's kind of that uh, ebb and flow that we see within any given society. Okay. So, the other thing that we see that really influences the amount of discrimination and prejudice we see within a society is something we call social mobility. Okay. And this is a process by which individuals attempt to change their social position by identifying less with their status group, with their less status group, and gain acceptance with part of a higher status group. Um, so, uh, uh, there's conditions that are necessary for this to happen. One is that the situation has to be stable and legitimate. What that means is that, or I should include this as well, that boundary of groups can also be permeable. Okay. You've probably all heard the saying of the glass ceiling, and that there's certain points that certain people can make, but they can't get beyond that ceiling. That's the idea permeability, is that can you easily go through that glass ceiling or can't you? Okay. And so in order to have true social mobility to move from one status to the next, you have to have that ability. So examples of what is assumed permeability here in the United States is the idea of capitalism. Okay. Capitalism is the idea of free trade, of free labor, of all of those things that really, and then you add the individualistic idea that anyone who has the fortitude can be successful in the United States because you have that ability to make money freely, trade freely, and whatnot. So it's assumed that here in the United States, anyone, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, race, can go from low status, economic status to high status. It's an assumption, though, right? Um, Whether that's real or not, we will talk about later when we get to things like systematic prejudice. Okay. Um, uh, and so those are the things that are necessary for people to change their status within a given culture. Okay. Um, the problems with it is more desirable members leave the low status groups, and to the individuals seeking higher status are never completely accepting and ending up in a more marginalized position. Okay. Kind of a perfect example of this is when we measure here in the United States white Europeans' attitudes towards Black athletes. Okay. This research has mainly been done within, for example, NBA stars and those kinds of individuals. And what they basically do in this research is pro provide a measure of acceptability. Okay, so let's take an individual superstar basketball player, and what happens to that individual that the white Europeans are running. Yes, I love that Michael Jordan or whoever. Okay, so has those individuals um, received the same status as the white European? Have they changed their social category? Or is there something else going on that provides them with that status? Okay. And research that looks at this has shown that while it is, when we say, and I'm going to put this uh, the best way I can, when we say the idea of better than chance, what I mean is that there's more than a 50% probability that a person does this. So when we look at specifically white Europeans, you have the superstar individual. What happens with them? Do they absorb them into the higher, quote unquote, higher status group, or are they not? And what we find is they don't. That what they individuals do with that is they put them in a special category. They put them in this category over here. That same status right now. But then what do we find when individuals then retire or leave public life or leave athletics? Well, that individual is then reabsorbed back into the general category, meaning that attitudes towards them when they are superstars are positive. When they leave, I shouldn't say lose, they leave their superstar status, the attitudes then become more negative and discriminatory and stereotypical. Okay. So when we talk about things such as status change from the perception of the higher status group, it's never about complete acceptance. It's about while they have this status, we'll put them in this kind of category over here, superstar. But then once they leave that superstar status, we're going to absorb them back into our stereotype of that group. Okay. And that's commonly what we see when we look at status groups based upon what a culture determines as the predominant culture versus the subcultures and all those kinds of things. Okay. And so it's an interesting thing what we do when we look at social mobility. Is it possible for people to move mobily, financially, and those kinds of things? Sure. But is that a true change, or is it just a recategorization until they prove otherwise? And that's kind of where the ground gets sticky. Okay. Um, and so this is what is considered social mobility. And again, um, I think persuasion, information, and whatnot about accepting other groups and accepting minority groups are wonderful. Is it truly occurring on a cognitive, psychological level? The evidence so far suggests, meh. So it really has to do with how, again, those vague categories. Okay. The more you know about an out group, and this is, I think, the important note to make at this time. The more you know about your outgroups, the less the negative stereotypes become. Okay. Because you have to start seeing them as human beings instead of seeing them as vague categories. Okay. Some examples. So I'll give some personal examples and we'll be done for today. I think I've mentioned that I was raised in the Northwest, not the Seattle area, but more eastern Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, northern Utah. Um, and in that area, when I was being raised, for example, the area that I graduated high school from was 96 white European. Okay. And my dad, I think probably was one of the most discriminatory people that now I realize in my memory. All right. I remember he said, things like, don't run over a Mexican because then you're going to lose traction because they're greasers. Uh, uh, he'd hand me a shovel and go ahead, be careful, that's a Mexican backhoe. Um, he would say things like, the only good black man is a, and he didn't say dead, but a non-existent. Okay. In the community that I was raised in, I remember, well, this is when I was an adult, just finishing college. Some of the first black families started to move into the communities, and they were uh, business owners, well off. They were in nice neighborhoods, all of those kinds of things. And they were referred to as the community's token blacks, meaning that they were seen as tokens. Aha, here we are. We're more diverse now. But they weren't referred to as just neighbors. They were referred to as tokens. Okay. That's what I was raised in. And then I was also made to believe that, if you touch a gay man, he's going to make you gay, all of those kinds of things. This is Idaho, you guys. So I just want you, this is Idaho. I even remember between the two towns I lived in, there was the Fort Hall Reservation. And my dads and brothers would tell stories about don't go to the Fort Hall Reservation. They'll take you down to the Snake River and rape you and kill you. There's so many white people that are missing by going on to the reservation. So don't go there. Just highly, okay. So that's what I was raised in, and I want to make that very clear. Okay. Um, but then I went to college, and probably the first situation that I was entered into is in the college that I went to, in the university I went to, they had this movie theater, which was really cool. It was a single projector movie theater. It was free to students. It was kind of a cool thing. It's when they used to use film. And so I became the manager of it, the student manager of it. And I had this employee who we loved to joke around and do the guy talk, do all the things, and whatnot. And I remember one day I walked into the building and he's like, "Hey, Curtis, I really want you to meet someone." And in the atrium, there was this little sitting area, and there was a guy sitting there. I'm like, "Oh, cool, okay, let's go." And I'm thinking, brother, friend, I don't know, colleague, someone special to him. And he goes, "This is my partner. We live together, we're together." And I remember having an epiphany that night. My dad said if I hang around gays, I would become gay. It didn't happen. And I really, really like this guy. He's a good friend. Am I supposed to stop not liking him? And so that was kind of a breaking point, and then later on, um, about, let's see, what was it? Almost 15 years ago, I moved from Idaho to Yuma. And to kind of speak to things that can occur when you yourself don't choose your own in group. I moved to Yuma, and there were these women, Mexican American, indigenous, and oh my, they kind of got my heart going. And so I started to date what then I just thought were Latino women, right? And it's interesting. Then I announced it on Facebook, and 50% of my family, at that time, I had 108 family members on my Facebook, and 62 of them unfriended me. Today, the total number, now that I'm married to a Mexican American woman, I have 20 family members on my Facebook, and that's it. And they don't even talk to me. There's two that do. And so, again, that transition phase, when I started working for LGBTQ rights, all of my male friends disappeared, except one. When I started TOCC, believe it or not, and they're like, hold on, what in Greek does that stand for? Because they assumed it was some fancy academic term for I don't know. I don't know. And I'm like, well, it's a Native American nation in southern Arizona, and it's their tribal college. And they go, oh, I think you could do better. I mean, really? You're teaching there for them? And so that's been my experience going through the world and navigating these differences and these changes and realizing. And the thing that I realize is the more people have an impermeable layer, okay? And what I mean by that is, again, I'll say this kind of the Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Montana bubble that protects that group, that protects that kind of attitude and that kind of belief, it's very unchangeable. I've spent most of my adult life trying to show my family and the communities I came from that, hey, there's nothing wrong with LGBTQ. There's nothing wrong with different races. There's nothing wrong with working at a tribal nation. In fact, it gives you a lot of privileges, in my opinion. And it's just interesting how that sticks so hard and is so impermeable. It really kind of has shown me how a person can enslave other people just by a simple mindset or take advantage of another group by a simple mindset, just a simple mindset, especially when they've never had any interaction with that other group and they just have a vague understanding of where they came from. So I just wanted to kind of relay that kind of story in my journey because it has really kind of highlighted some things for me trying to teach this and trying to really understand it and also understand my own personal biases and prejudices and all those kinds of things. But I would say that just from my perspective, I love my Mexican wife and I love this college. Okay, I want to make that very clear. Um, and so in fact, if you want me to make an academic comparison, The reason why I love teaching at TOCC is you guys, as far as education, kind of do the reverse. A lot of times my students, they understand the technical end of things. How to write a paper and the MLA and an APA style, but they never get it conceptually. The thing that I love about teaching at TOCC is I can come and talk to you guys about a theory and the abstract ideas, and you guys get it much quicker than the students I teach for. I also teach for SNHU and for GCU and for Walden University sometimes. And I love coming here and talking because I get to talk more on that higher level stuff. Believe it or not, you guys are perfectly capable of the higher level stuff than my experience with my other traditional college students in the world. So I just want to make that point. I love when you guys write. Hence, I was hoping you guys would pick the short answer thing, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll do the quiz. All right. Anyways, let's end with that and we'll stop our sharing. We'll stop recording.